Day 2 of the SuperUnited Croatia Rapid Blitz is really heating up with tons of decisive results in the first round for today. In first place, we have Fabiano Caruana with 9 points, with the sole lead, followed closely by Wesley So with 8 points, and a three-way tie for third place with Alireza, Gukesh, and MVL. 7 points each. Starting with round 4 today, there were 5 decisive results, so every single game was a win-lose situation. Starting here with Alireza Firouzja versus Anish Giri. Firouzja with the white pieces here. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. Very normal stuff. d3, bishop c5, c3, castle, d6, rook e1. This has all been seen. h6, bishop h4, g5, bishop g3, and bishop a7, knight a3, and now g4. Here, white played the move bishop h4. The computer gives that a double exclam. And the point of this move is if you take the seemingly free knight on f3, queen takes f3, this pin is extremely difficult to deal with. Take a look at the bishop here on a7. This dark square bishop is about as far away from the king and these dark square weaknesses as possible. The knight on c6 is not really in a place where it can support the knight on f6, so the only way to defend this knight is to play the move king g7, which is already a bad sign. This theme has been seen before. Sometimes the pawn on h6 is not present, and black can play rook h8 to h6 and defend the knight this way, and plus have some sort of counterplay on the h-file, but here that's not even possible, so it's kind of a better version of that. So it is very well worth giving up the piece to do this. Black, instead of taking on f3 right away, played king g7 first, h3, kind of forcing matters. G takes f3, queen takes f3, bishop e6, bishop d5, just centralizing a piece. The knight on c6 is kind of running out of squares, if you'll notice. The knight cannot go to e7, because then we're breaking the connection between the queen and the knight, that would just lose a piece. So this bishop cannot actually be captured, because after e takes d, the knight will have to go to b8, which is setting up for the next game. Queen e7, connecting the rooks, possibly making a square for the knight, I'm not sure. d4, just completely blasting open the center. This makes sense when black has such a weak king, and white is already set up to put all of the pieces in the center and just try to build up on this pin as much as possible. White is down a piece, but the counterplay is immeasurable. So bishop d7, knight c2, bringing another piece into the game. The knight can come into the game in multiple ways, possibly knight e3 to f5 or to g4 even, but it's also just supporting the center. So black actually sacrifices the queen now with knight takes d5, and the point being, white was already down a piece. Black just took a piece, and if I take the queen, that's a third piece that black is getting. And the shocking thing, I think, here is that after d5, which was like the natural thing in my opinion, black just goes knight b8. These pieces don't seem to be doing a whole lot. I mean, 3 pieces for a queen is almost always a good thing, but it's just a little shocking to me that the pieces can be so passive and it be totally fine. But at the same time, white's play to make up for this lack of development, or take advantage of it rather, would be, I think, to open the king more and attack. This is kind of hard to do because the bishop on a7 is hindering rook movements and the knight. So I'm not really sure here. This looks very scary for me. I would lose this with both colors, as a lot of people say, but this is a lot higher level chess than I'm used to. So white did not take the queen. White simply played queen g3 check, defending the bishop, bringing more power into the g file here. And after king h7, e takes d. And now we have another pin in the center. The queen is still attacked. Now white is also attacking the knight on c6, and at least winning back the piece. So f6 is sort of forced, because, okay, what else are you doing? You have to move your queen. f6 takes. Again, we're attacking another piece on d7. Takes, and then this I thought was very cool. So d takes e, just vacating a square in the center for the knight. So now we go knight d4. The f5 square is just a fantastic looking square in my opinion, hitting the queen, this weak h6 pawn. It's difficult to say exactly if we can take advantage of that, again, because this bishop's a very good defender, and possible attacker. But it's doing a lot of things. Black can take this in many ways. This pin on f6 is quite annoying. The e5 pawn could be weak. You could even choose to play this very positionally and double the pawns. So Black plays bishop d7 to stop that option and to cover f5. Makes a lot of sense. Queen d3 check, king h8. And now all of these light squares are pretty weak. White can just bring in another rook. Probably, no, he just played knight f5. So knight f5, attacking h6, queen h7, pinning the knight, g4, cementing the knight on this outpost. So this knight's never going to leave unless Black gives up the bishop pair for it. And even then, these pawns in the endgame will be very, very easy to take advantage of because this pawn chain is kind of backwards and it's already being attacked by dark squared bishop. And again, this bishop is doing things, but if it needs to be doing things on the king side, that's going to take a long time to do. So h5, rook d1, all of White's pieces are just absolutely beautiful. Bishop e6, king g2, queen g6. Now we're lining up the queen with the king here. f3, so again, just I think solidifying the knight where it is, being just over defensive in a good way. King h7, queen e4, centralizing the queen, making way for the rook on the d file. Bishop b6, c4, another really good positional move, I think. Just saying I want full control over the d5 square, and I want to hinder your light squared bishop, and maybe someday I'll even play c5 and shut down this bishop forever. So rook d8, knight g3, h takes g, takes, now this h file's open, that could be useful someday. Queen takes e4, knight takes e4 because, you know, the rook would be hanging. Rook takes d1, rook takes d1. I still think White's position is fantastic here because this knight is so good in the center. White has the only open file, well, aside from the h file, that could be something to fight for. But this weakness on f6 is just already being attacked so many times that king g6 is semi-forced. And now we finally see c5, and say what you will about the bishop pair, but this knight, I think, is worth the bishop pair in this position, especially with this bishop. So bishop back to a7, b3. Again, I kind of think just stunting the bishop on e6. f5. I think this is trying to get rid of Black's weakness so that Black's pieces are not as tied down, and also maybe breaking apart White's pawns. G takes f, bishop takes, bishop f2. Okay, this is probably just equal. I still would take White here any day. It's just a matter of creating enough weaknesses to actually win this game. At this point, Alireza has 18 seconds and Giri has 1 minute, so they're blitzing out these moves at this point. So bishop e6, bishop g3, attacking this weakness that was left behind. King f5, rook h1, moving to the other open file, and this one's probably a little bit better because it's not as defended on the 7th rank by this bishop. So bishop f7, rook h7, king g6, rook h4. Again, this pawn needs to be defended. Bishop d5, rook g4, king f7. We just take the free pawn. Bishop takes e4. We have intermezzo, accurate check of playing rook f4 first before playing takes on e4, so that we can trade the rooks into just a winning endgame where this is same colored bishops, so it's not going to be quite as tricky to win as opposite colored bishops. One pawn is definitely enough. One passed pawn is enough to win. But it would be easier if White creates a second weakness. So just both players playing quickly, trying to activate their kings. White wants to trade off the A pawn for the B pawn so that 2 passed pawns will be on the board and Black's pieces will just be overworked. So that is what Alireza does in time. Takes some rerouting of the king and the bishop. But now the bishop is on this very short diagonal and White finally is controlling its only other square. So it either has to move off of that diagonal or the king has to move, which allows the white king to get in further. King e6. Black is trying to keep the white king out, but we make like a waiting move, And now, again, either you have to play this move, allowing bishop c7, or move your king and let the king in. So bishop c7, bishop c5, and now a4, very strong move. If you push, then this pass pawn is just too strong. I think bishop b6 maybe would just win, I think. It just looks completely winning. And if takes, then we have two pass pawns, and this happened in the game, and black resigned shortly. So my favorite comment is Giri finally proving Giri always draws haters wrong. Come to find out he lost, unfortunately. So that's game 1 of round 4. Coming into game 2 of round 4, we have MVL with white versus Gukesh. The opening starts out e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. Sort of a more rare move, I think, but maybe at my level I actually see it kind of a lot. Knight f6, e5, d5, the correct response, I think. If you just move the knight, I don't know, knight g4 or something, there's probably just bishop takes f7 already. Knight g5, picking up this doesn't look correct to me. This looks difficult to actually manually castle and get this rook on h8 out. I think that this would be pretty bad, even if it's technically playable by computer standards. So d5, making a pawn move in the center, and fighting here. Bishop b5, knight back to g8. I think the only thing I'll say is that knight d7 and knight b8 is another common idea, and then play it like almost like a Caro type structure. Knight g8 is fine as well. d4, e6, c3, bishop d7, bishop a4, takes on d4, takes knight e7, knight c3, h4. So this is a very typical idea in Caro-Kann structures and in the French sometimes, where you play h4, try to induce some sort of weakness on the light squares here, put the bishop on the long diagonal to then take advantage of those newly found light squared weaknesses. h6, h5. Another thing this is doing is just gaining space, something that the computers love to do. Bishop c2, and I already love white's position at this point. I'm kind of a Caro-Kann hater. I don't understand why people play like this. That's not what this is, but it reminds me of it. Rook c8, putting the rook on the only open file, castles. Knight a5, bishop d3, queen b6, rook b1, a6, bishop e3, all normal developing moves. And knight c4. So knight c4 is attacking the bishop on e3 and the knight on, or the pawn on b2, which is defending our knight on c3. So there could be some tactics involved with knight takes b2 and rook takes c3. Not sure yet. White just played queen e2, which does kind of a lot of things at once. It's a multi-purpose move. Defends b2. It connects the rooks. It over defends the e3. It could be doing a lot of things, I think. Queen a5, knight d2, b5, knight b3, coming in with tempo, and eyeing this big juicy c5 square. So queen d8, and white plays the move, knight c5, naturally. If b4 is allowed to be played, I'm wondering how that knight's ever getting evicted from that spot. At this point, still can't really evict the knight. Knight c6, b4 is played, but the computer gives it a question mark. I find that very shocking. It seems like such a natural move. Better, apparently, is knight takes d7, queen takes, and queen g4, making it difficult to develop in castle because you're eyeing the g7 square. These bishops are strong. I mean, it all makes sense. It's a little inhuman to take the light squared bishop because it's such a bad piece. Trading that piece off for the beautiful knight on c5, it's just so unnatural. I think I would rather trade the dark squared bishop if I have to give up my knight, and I think that that is what MVL maybe thought as well. So b4 is natural. Bishop takes c5, b takes c5, and now in the end game, when everything's traded, I like looking at the pawn structures in the middle game, seeing, okay, this is a passed pawn. That might be a huge advantage. You can play a4 and open the b file. The bishops are just crazy strong in this position. So queen h4, trying to start some sort of counterplay. g3, queen h3, we're not going back. That is not the point. Now this queen is actually, it looks close to being trapped, but it's actually really hard to take advantage of. It takes way too many moves to put the bishop on f1. So a4 is played. Again, just playing on the queen side. It makes a lot of sense. That's where all the pieces are. Knight e7 is a blunder. For why? I don't know. So a takes b is played. A takes, knight takes, bishop takes, rook takes. Okay, it's just a pawn. But why? Instead, he should play b4 and hang on to his pawn. And then knight e4 here. And of course, if takes, okay, this e-pawn's probably going to be lost anyway. And this is weak. This is a hard decision to make. I think both decisions look bad. For some reason, the computer likes this. Okay, a5, yeah, and then you get your own passed pawn. Perhaps a4 is weak. And maybe black gets a lot of counterplay at some point. But that's a difficult decision to make. So instead, we played knight e7, takes, take everything on b5, castle, rook c1, pretty automatic stuff. Knight e3, queen takes e3, yeah, queen takes e3. I don't know why I even hesitated on that, the g-pawn was hanging. Now h4 is hanging, or h5 is hanging. King g2, rook h1 is maybe a threat. This queen is very, very offsided here, and all of the plays is going to be attached to the c-pawn. So f5, trying to break out, trying to start things of his own, but after it takes on f6, rook takes f6, rook h1, queen f7, attacking f2, rook b2, rook f8. This is kind of a good idea from black to open the f-file and put absolutely everything on it so that white's pieces are also more tied down and it's difficult to coordinate some sort of pawn push at this point. So f4 is played. If you can't defend this weakness over and over again, just push it and hope that you're not making anything else weak in the process. So knight c6, kind of blockading. It seems like it's not going to stay there to me at all, but maybe eyeing this, maybe, not really sure. Rook b6, and then knight goes back. Okay, black has 27 seconds at this point, so we're starting to understand. Rook e1, rook a8, rook e2, just over defending the second rank here. Queen h5, queen e5, knight f5, jumping into action. And as we said earlier, the only bad thing about pushing the f-pawn is if you're weakening something else, like the g-pawn, for example. Bishop takes f5, rook takes f5, queen e6 check, king h7, and rook b1. This is a very passive move. My intuition would be to try and have something happen on the 7th rank, but at the same time, in time pressure, I'd probably, I don't know what I'd do. Rook b1, rook a3, eyeing the weak g-pawn. And actually, MVL blundered mate here with rook h1, allowing queen f3 check. And, okay, king h2 is not possible because queen g3 is mate. And otherwise, like king g1, you still take on g3, and then probably rook f... This looks like mate, right? Yeah. The computer's saying this, but it's the same thing. Okay. So actually, shockingly, MVL lost this game, even though it looked like he was pressing the entire time. Pretty devastating stuff. Next up here, we have Vidit versus Wesley So. Vidit with the white pieces. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e5. Extremely normal things. I'm going to kind of breeze past this opening. So white is sort of being forced to give up the bishop pair at this point because leaving the knight here I think is pretty bad. Now the knight can actually go back to e6, maybe? Is that a thing? I don't know. Queen d2, yeah, knight e6, knight g3, f6, breaking open the center, and oh, look at this. This bishop on a7 once again is trying to come alive. Bishop f5, g6, takes on e6, takes on e6. Okay, so now we have a situation where black has the bishop pair and white has the knight apple. And typically you don't want the apple when you can have a pair. So queen e7, just defending along the 7th. E takes f6. The other problem with queen e7 is that it opens up this pin. So that could be a big issue. Rook f6, and okay, the whole idea, I think, is to play on the f-file once again, and that really complements this bishop on a7. The move rook e3 is given a question mark, and the only reason for that is that the very natural-looking knight g5, most people would say, okay, I want to play knight g5, but it undefends my d4 pawn, and makes f2 really, really hard to defend. Rook e2, most natural move, preparing rook lift and also defending f2. Okay, rook f8. Here, the computer just says, yeah, this is fine. Just play knight h1, obviously. Put the knight in the corner, the best square for the knight, defend on f2, and double the rooks. And this position is fine, obviously. I think that that's one of the hardest moves to make as a chess player, is putting your knight in the corner here. Shout out Chess Doofus. So that is what knight g5 is a good move, but it wasn't played because it looks ridiculous. Instead, rook e3, which is probably more logical by human standards. Queen g7, for some reason, is a miss. Queen f8 is better. I suppose because the small difference of when white takes the queen, you're developing my rook for me rather than bringing my king up. Both are useful, but having those rooks doubled on the f-file is extremely useful. So queen g7, though, takes, rook e1, and now, okay, if the white rooks get in on the 7th, that could definitely be an issue. The knights hop into the center. It's not clear yet who's better. So rook a3, interesting. My instinct would be to play this move, but okay, so after rook f7, rook 7 e3, I don't know. It just says equal. I don't know. Rook a3, attacking the a pawn, maybe hoping for a pin and like b4. Bishop b6. Oh, so now we go rook b3, attacking the bishop, x-raying the pawn on b7. So it is aimed at the 7th rank, but just in a fancier way. Rook a6 is sort of forced because of this, but now the rook and the bishop are ugly, I think. Like, especially the rook on a6, that's not where he wants to be. a4, cementing these pieces in the tomb. Rook e6, takes, knight e2. And the knight the pony is heading for greener pastures. Probably f4, eventually maybe. g4, controlling light squares so that the bishop is more restricted. Okay, bishop c8, defending b7, trying to free up his just stinky pieces over here on the queen side. Rook e3, reactivating this rook, because it doesn't make sense to keep the rook on the b-file anymore if it's not actually keeping the pieces passive. So now we put it on a better square. It's done its job. Bishop c7, king g2, just activating a piece. So the problem with this is that the b pawn is hard to defend now after rook b6, king g2, rook b6. Instead, knight e1 to play knight d3, activating the knight in a way that's both looking at all these nice squares, controlling the dark squared bishop's path, but also defending on b2 would be a little bit better. So king g2, bishop e6, better would be rook b6, bishop e6, b3, and this was the plan to defend the pawn. Rook a8, knight e1 now, heading for these things we've mentioned. And now h5, and black is really trying to induce weaknesses in white's pawn structure at this point, and just open things up for the bishops. f3, keeping it solid. Rook e8, knight d3, bishop f7, king f2, takes, and g5. So this endgame is equal. It was equal for a very, very long time. Both players are under a minute here. And this is a situation where Wesley So is going to press until he can't press anymore, until the defending side finally makes a mistake, because it's just impossible to defend forever. So we're kind of going to speed through this for time's sake, because we have a lot of games to go through. The knights are just trying to dance back and forth and not allow black to make progress, and kind of dance between these squares where the knight can be anchored and defended by pawns. And by the way, 2 bishops versus 1 knight is technically, I think, a win for the bishops. So that's not even something we can try. We have to keep everything on the board. And this was almost a perpetual, but black played king d7. And let's skip ahead here to the point where it all went wrong. And this is where Vidit made the crucial error. So he stepped out of the pin, which is very, very logical. At this point, it's kind of too late, because after this move, e4 is able to be played because we stopped controlling e4. And after knight b5, white missed d3 check. King takes d3 can't be played because after king takes g4, there is a pin that is already built up on, and white will resign. So instead, I think the only way was actually just to take this pawn. This still seems losing though. It's the type of situation where kind of no matter what the computer says in a practical game, white will eventually lose. So it did end with Wesley So winning after d3. Some moves are played, and I think resignation. Yes, this was another brutal point. King f4 was a very cute try, because if d8, d1 equals queen, knight e3 check picks up the queen, and Wesley So is like, all right, I'll just defend that square. That's easy enough for me. So after takes, okay, no, he played this, and then he just went back to that square again because he couldn't promote. So that is another win for Wesley So. Okay, moving on to Jan Nepomniachtchi versus Ivan Saric. Jan with the white pieces. So we have like a fast queen trade, g3, bishop b7, and this is a very typical plan to play a4 and sort of a minority attack. The bishops are very much lined up at the queen side to take advantage of this, and we want to open the a file and use that to play on. So knight d2, a5, f5. So the problem with f5 is that it weakens the e6 square. I think that the idea is to open up the diagonal for the light-squared bishop where there are a lot of weak squares around the king, but it is sort of a risky move. So knight c4 takes, and of course, why wouldn't we put the bishop on this diagonal that we just opened up? So bishop takes e4, bishop takes e6, king f8, f3, kicking that bishop off of the long diagonal. And after rook d1, b5, a6, this is a very nice little positional move, stopping a6 from happening. And now the issue is, okay, if this pawn's ever won in the endgame, white is just winning. Like, this is usually either a huge asset or it can be a weakness at points because it is so far away from other pawns. But after c4, now this bishop is really open and aiming at that a7 pawn. It's kind of making it hard to move this rook on a8. I assume that's the main issue. So g5 now, but rook a5, all of these weak-ish pawns are on the same file. It really makes sense to put the rook here. Bishop f2, defending the bishop on e6, rook b8. So g4, I think g4 is played so that black doesn't play g4 and open up the square, maybe. So now white is controlling both light squares. Bishop g5, bishop g3. It looks quite good already. Rook f6, takes, bishop a7, rook takes a6, bishop c5. So there was this was a mistake because why? Bishop e6 is better. Defending the a6 pawn, still threatening to take on a7. And here, if bishop b6 with check, defending the pawn after king g2, the threat is that after bishop d6 check, the king will be forced either to the e file, where I'll have a discovered check picking up the bishop, or to g7, where black will pick up the rook. And there's not really a great way to defend against this. How does black answer that threat? I have no idea. It says bishop f5, takes, but then we just go rook e6 and we're threatening to take on b6 and promote our pawn. So that's pretty brutal stuff. But anyway, taking on a7 is normal. Bishop c5, activating the rook, and then this was a weird situation where both sides were close to getting checkmated with a rook and two bishops up in their face. The pawn structure will favor white though, because white is just up a pawn, and if the c pawn is won, then white wins the game. So rook e2, bishop f2, g4, opening up the king. h5 takes, yeah, h4. And now again we see this theme where black is trying to play h3, fixing a pawn on the very last square, and then maybe this becomes a very big asset in the endgame. So king f3, rook e6, bishop b2, check. I think that there was some sort of goofy mate here, like here for example. I believe this is mate 1. So that's kind of a funny thing that could have happened. It never was going to happen, but it could. So rook e5, rook b5, and now it's kind of impossible to not trade the rooks, because after check, king d4 attacking the rook on e5, we have check, and then bishop e6, which is a very clean win. Also bishop e5 with a similar idea of just attacking this pawn, but here the difference is now I'm attacking this bishop on e4 with check, so if you move, I win a piece. So you kind of have to just trade the rooks and lose your bishop, and this is a lost endgame, so black resigned. And finally for round 4, day 2, we have Fabiano Caruana versus Levon Aronian. Fabi with the white pieces. And this isn't the game I'm thinking of. Fabi played a very bizarre opening today. This is very normal. White plays the move f3. That's usually where the knight goes, but it's all about that center control. There are drawbacks to it, like you can't use that square for your knight anymore, but you have this very strong center. So c5 takes, knight takes, d takes. There goes the strong center. Queen a5, attacking all of these little pawns that are left on dark squares. But white just simply plays the move e4. Now, after something like knight c3 attacking the queen, threatening discoveries with check, queen d2, and then, I don't know, probably bishop b2, king f2. Like, the position is actually just totally fine for white. So that's not ideal. And then if queen takes, again, there's like bishop d2 defending the rook. And then the queen has to move somewhere. Where the queen goes, I don't know. Probably here. Or here. But the bishops are just very, very active and strong. So after e4, knight c7, king f2, we're not castling, we're just getting the king safe quickly. The bishops will be very good defenders of the king. And we still have a lot of center control. Even though our center looks a bit weird, we're still controlling all of these central squares. So castles, bishop e3, knight a6, trying to build up on this weakness and win some pawns. a4, knight c5, queen d6. And now these dark squares, black doesn't have a dark squared bishop, by the way. That's why I think all of the play is going to be happening on the dark squares. b6, the entire queen side needs to be developed. Bishop b5, entombing the queen. The queen has no squares except for c3. If queen takes c3 right now, there's knight e2, and everything's coming with tempo. And this is a game of activity, not of material. So we are not counting material at any point. This is not worth taking a pawn. So instead, bishop a6 is still a blunder, because it doesn't actually help your queen at all. Is a blunder. Knight e2, very logical, defending the queen's only escape square, developing a piece, connecting the rooks, increasing that activity. Bishop takes b5, and we do not just simply recapture here and allow queen takes b5, and black has equalized because they got their pawn, and that's enough for the activity. No, we take on c5, b takes c5, queen takes c5, the bishop is pinned, and so we're going to be able to take on b5 and have it defended, and come with a tempo, and have the a file, and have our king safe. It's a very, very good situation for white. So knight d7, we still take with the pawn even though our queen's attacked, because now the rooks are ready to be doubled, ready to send these pawns down the board and make queens. Knight d3, and my instinct here was to play king e3, and I didn't understand why it wasn't played. King g3 was played here, and I guess the reason that you wouldn't play king e3 here is something like either knight b2 or knight e5. And having these annoying forks to deal with, I either have to move my rook from a square where it's perfectly fine, or move my king again. So that's why king g3. a move that looks like it wins a tempo actually loses tempi. F5, trying to open the king, possibly, get some counterplay with the rooks. We take on F5, close that down, knight F4, takes, and this is just, I feel like, just a one endgame. The white rooks are too active, there's too many passed pawns, the black king is stuck on the 8th rank here, and then we get the blind piggies on the 7th. I think black resigns here. So, those were all the games for round 4, day 2. They were all decisive. We had to look at all of them. Now we're going to move on to rounds 5 and 6. So for round 5, there was only one decisive game. Everything else was a draw, which is fair after a result that shed so much blood. So Ivan Saric versus Fabiano Caruana, the leader of the tournament. Knight f3. This game surprised me, to say the least. So knight f3, knight f6, g3. This is normal. b5. Okay, maybe this is something that everybody knows except for me. This looks like a crazy house or variant opening. Like b5, e3, a6. Okay, we're defending the pawn. It's all very logical. b3, bishop b7, c4. What are we playing 3-check? This looks like a 3-check setup where the king is just guarded from checks, and you know, c4 not opening up. I don't know, this looks very goofy to me, but it turns into just like a normal chess position. Bishop g2, bishop g7, d4, f5, castle, a3. And white just has like this massive center. Black has 2 bishops to try and compensate for this, but I don't know, this is looking quite good. As I think Giri says that when there are 2 bishops on the same diagonal, the one that's defended is the better one. So maybe this light squared bishop is a little bit better. So a3, a5, takes, and now this b-pawn is probably a target. We take on a8, and the a-file is something to fight for. Knight d2, getting a piece into the game. Perhaps c5 and knight c4, but that would give up the d5 square, so maybe that's not so good. c5 is played by black, and after queen c2, queen a4 is a mistake. Why is queen a4 a mistake? Black should play d6. Rook a1, knight c6. I don't really understand. So queen a5, rook d1. So to take advantage of this, white would have to play d5. What if d6 then? Then e4. I guess the queen is just misplaced here, if the pawns are going to stay closed. Maybe? I mean, you could also say that black already had sufficient control over a1 and didn't need to bring the queen in, unless you were aiming for a3, which doesn't make any sense. So maybe that's why. Queen a5, rook d1, knight a6, h4. Yeah, we want to make this pawn structure a little bit worse. Maybe drive the pawn all the way up the board. Maybe just gain space. Maybe make luft. Does a lot of things. C takes d. Knight takes, and now these bishops are staring at each other. Bishop takes g2, king takes g2, knight c5. Perhaps b3 is the target at this point. Knight f3, rook a8, and we have control over one of the only things going on in the position. Knight e1, retreating move, but I think aiming to probably build up on the b4 pawn. Queen a3. Okay, so this was the idea. It just came a little bit later. And the idea now is, okay, maybe I can give up my dark squared bishop if it means I get the b-pawn to go and make a queen. Dark squared bishop's worth a queen. Rook b1, queen a6, knight d3, queen b7. Now we're aiming at these light squares that there's no bishop on. Knight e4, knight b5, bishop c3. Ooh. Threatening knight d2, knight f3 stuff, maybe? Like really trying to infiltrate and attack here. So rook d1, defending against that. d5, knight f4 exclam? I mean, you tell me why. I don't know. D takes c, b takes c, and now this is a passed pawn suddenly. So this is getting a little bit hairy for the white pieces. Queen c6, queen e2. Bishop goes back to g7. Now it's just going to be a sniper and try to help actually escort the pawn. Knight d5, c5, knight d4. This pawn's looking a little weak to me. Bishop f8. Apparently, what? Knight c3. Knight c3 takes. Rook c1. Oh, and then, okay. Yeah. Yeah, that was missed. Maybe he just wanted to keep the pieces on the board. He probably saw this. So bishop f8, g4, trying to do counterplay. Queen takes g4, knight c3. Taking is a mistake. Oh, knight b3. Knight b3. That would be a good try, because we're attacking the queen. You do not have time to take my rook, because I take your queen. If you move the queen, like here, there's queen f3. I'm threatening to win your queen again with knight f6 check. So something needs to be done about that, like defending the queen. And now I have time to move my rook. And I'm kind of holding things together, just barely. So I guess that's why taking on c3 is not quite so good, because this pawn is just so close to the end zone. So queen e2, rook a4, rook c1, take on c4. This is yeah, that's a big blunder, but it was already over at this point. If takes, queen takes c1. So white just resigned. So Fabi wins another game and is still in the sole lead going into round 6. And finally, for round 6, we had 2 decisive games. The first one being Jan Nepomniachtchi versus Gukesh. The game started. e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3. A closed Sicilian of sorts. Knight f6, bishop b5, knight d4. I believe this is all theory that's been seen before, so we'll kind of go a little bit quicker here. This I'm actually just not clear on if it's theory or not, but it looks normal enough to me. d4 breaking in the center. And here after takes, I think that if knight takes d4, e5 is sort of an annoying move. You have to move the knight again. Black gets control over the center kind of for free. So Jan played a smart move. He played knight e4. Not recapturing right away, but bringing a piece into the center with tempo himself. And look at all these central squares that white is controlling. So queen c6, rook e1. Again, I had to defend my knight. Bishop g4, in a way defending the d-pawn. Bishop f4. I can only assume that e5 is the main point that we're playing around. Castle's queenside. So we actually have opposite sides castling in a way that we don't normally say, where black castles queenside and white castles kingside. This reminds me of like some Scandinavian positions a little bit. Knight g5. Bishop takes f3, knight takes f3. Okay. So black gave up the light squared bishop pretty much unprompted. Yeah, okay, e5 can be played here. Wow. e5? How does this work? Knight takes f7. Knight takes f7, bishop takes f3, queen takes. Oh, knight c2. I didn't see knight c2. Okay. Sure. Alright, whatever. Takes on f3, knight takes f3, queen f6, bishop g3. I like white here quite a bit. This pawn on d3 is maybe a bit threatening, but I think it can also easily become a weakness. I think that this white won the fight for the e5 square, if that's even what was going on. And also white's king, or black's king, is really not safe. You can't really finish castling by playing king b8 when you don't have any pawns in front of your king and there's a bishop staring at you. So rook e5, just placing a rook on that square. I think computer wanted queen b3, which is also logical. Knight c6, rook d5. That's a cute little maneuver. The computer doesn't like it for whatever reason, but the point, I think, is to just disconnect the rook from the d-pawn and just try and pick up on that weak, far away from home pawn. So queen takes b2. takes, knight takes, knight e5. I don't know, black's king side is not developed, and black's king is very much vulnerable. So f6, knight takes d3, queen d4, rook b1, automatic, e5, queen b3, building up a battery. Right now it doesn't matter because of this knight, but in the future it might. And notice how there's not really a great place for this rook right now because this knight is in the way and there's no other open file for it. And if the knight moves, you get checkmated, probably. So that's probably an issue. Rook d1. It's always good to put your rook on the same file as a queen. Queen e4. Keeping the queen central, but still over defending b7. f3 is considered a mistake because after queen c6, bishop f2, knight e6. I mean, I can see that black is coming alive, but why is f3 specifically so bad? f4, it prefers... I think that it wants to break open this pawn chain and make this dark squared bishop powerful again. After f3, you're kind of just conceding that the bishop's going to this diagonal. But again, these dark squares around the king could be useful. So I don't know, I think it still makes sense. Knight b4, takes, rook d8, rook b1, rook d7, bishop b6, trying to take advantage of those said dark squares. Now the knight can't move because if the knight moves, there's queen f8 followed by mate. So queen d6, trying to trade. White says no. Queen d3, queen b4, queen d2, and uh-oh. I feel like black is the one attacking now. The second rank is a teensy bit weak. So the knight comes into f4, and there's no rook to play rook f2. Mate is threatened. The only way to stop it is bishop f2. And after knight e2 check, the knight reroutes to this nice d4 square attacking the queen. Knight back to e6. Bishop g1. I remember how this game ended. It's very nice. So queen d3, trading the queens, or forcing the queen backwards. King d8. This is all being played with like 20 seconds on Gukesh's clock. c5, king e7, queen b6, knight d8, rook b3, queen d5, queen a7. Black's king kind of ran to a very safe place here in the center. There's just not a lot going on over here anymore. White's king, however, to me looks almost more vulnerable because as long as c6 is not working, I think black's totally fine. So, still running away, queen a8, h6. Every move is a mistake in time pressure. h3, this is a move you make just to make some air for your king, not really thinking. King g6, queen c8, queen c6. White is avoiding queen trades at all costs, even though it's making them put their queen in the corner, which I think is kind of silly. And finally, we bring the rook into d1, taking advantage of this pin. And the dark squares are in trouble. Queen c5 is threatened. Queen a7, queen a4, trying to get in this way. c6, what else are you going to do? You have to defend your bishop. Knight takes c6 with tempo. Queen e3, queen d5, rook takes b7, and now the knight comes back in, looking for a place to enter. Rook b2, and my favorite part, now, black played the move rook f1 in this position, attacking the queen. If the queen takes on f1, knight g3 wins the game. So instead, white plays queen c2, but now queen d4, and there's no way to defend these dark squares because the queen got kicked off of that diagonal with the help of the knight and the pawns and the rook and this weakened dark square. So very, very nice game. And finally, our last game we're going to be looking at today was Levon Aronian versus Ivan Saric. Levon with the white pieces, e4, c5, knight f3, d6. Another Sicilian where white's bringing out the light squared bishop early. This is apparently very trendy. Knight f6, d3, solid stuff. Knight a5, looking at this bishop. White is trying to break open the center while black's king is still there. A takes B, takes, E6, knight C3, just normal developing moves. There could be issues. This move is interesting. There could be issues with developing on the queen side because of this, and the control over the light squares. But also, white could be planning to swing the queen over to G3 and play bishop H6, potentially. Castles, bishop G5, H6, bishop H4. For bishop D2, it likes better. I don't know, it's computer. Bishop H4, knight D7, takes on D7, takes bishop G3. And then here's where the game gets really, really cool. So this is like basically a bishop pair at this point. The dark squares look very, very weak, and this light square bishop is hard to defend without moving pieces that are already have squares. So white played knight A4 naturally, looking at the weakened dark squares. Queen D8, and now Aronian plays the move bishop B8 here, which is just such a cool move. We saw something like this yesterday as well, but rook A8, queen G3. And that rook is running out of squares here. But more importantly, black is setting up for the next game. Queen D8 was just played, then rook A8. Meanwhile, white is just getting more and more pieces into the game. B5, bishop C7, forcing the queen to move another time, giving you control over the B6 square, which the knight now jumps to. Rook A7. This move has been played so many times at this point. Bishop B8, rook B7, fianchettoing the rook. And now we go back to E5, threatening checkmate. Black does not have time to take on B6. F6 is forced, but after knight takes C8, queen takes C8, bishop F4, threatening bishop takes H6, king H8, black just picks up this A6 pawn, and now because we induced F6, E6 is now a target. So I just thought that whole combination was incredible and very, very satisfying to watch. So E5, naturally, to try and make this not a weakness anymore, but now this dark square bishop looks pretty bad. Bishop E3, C4, queen G6, stepping into the light squares. And I don't know, like, if something bad, I'm already hoping for sacrifices along the 6th here. Like, you know, rar, something like that. That's insane. But bishop C5, takes on C5, queen takes C5, queen E4. And white is just up a pawn with better pieces and a better structure and a better king. So Levon will do what he does, and he's going to win this game. So B takes C, B takes C, rook A8, trying to clarify the position a little bit with a rook trade. Rook C8, and the 7th rank is looking weak, so we want to stack our pieces here. C takes D3, C takes D3, queen C7, and now we have passed pawn to look forward to. Rook D8, B5, just keep pushing it. Queen D3, H3, creating luft for the king. Queen D6, rook C1, queen B8, queen A6. And okay, we're not up a pawn anymore, but this pawn is kind of a strong one. E4 is a mistake. Instead, black should do something quiet, like king H7, which probably does something. I guess it prevents rook C8 and makes this rook able to move. But E5 is trying to start counterplay, I suppose, of his own, create weaknesses around the king, and maybe even win with like rook D2, queen G2, queen G3, I mean. B6, E3, takes, queen E5, queen E2, just being defensive. Rook B1, holding on to everything. This rook is really doing God's work at this point. Queen C2, defending all my stuff. And now queen C7 wins the game, because if you take, you can't actually take my rook because I check and pick up your rook at the end. So what did black play? Check, rook E8, rook A3, king H7, and finally the 7th rank weakness is coming through, and Levon won this game. that about wraps up day 2 of the Croatia Super Rapid and Blitz. As a reminder, here are the standings. Fabiano and Caruana with clear first place, and we will see who comes out on top. Thanks for watching. See you next time.